The room nobody read. Stay in the room. May 2026. At a Green Party regional conference earlier this month, Zack Polanski made the argument for European alignment as practical national interest. From the floor, a voice called out, "Older male," the specific accent of trade unionism. He said the European Union was a boss's club, always had been. Scattered applause. Not loud, not isolated. That sound, in that hall, was the load-bearing wall of British progressive politics, showing the crack that has been running through it since 2020. One misreading of one coalition in 2020 has produced cascading fractures across 3 political parties and a generation of progressive politics. The misreading was not inevitable. It was a specific failure of analysis at a specific moment, by a specific person whose job required him to read that room correctly. He read a different room, the one he was standing in, and mistook it for the country. The Corbyn coalition was held together by negative unity, shared opposition to austerity, to the post-2010 Conservative project, to a Labour establishment seen as having abandoned its base. Inside the coalition were 2 groups whose positions on the single most consequential British political question of the previous decade were structurally incompatible. The young progressive majority, the post-2015 membership surge, social media generation, activists energised by Corbyn's leadership campaigns, were ardently pro-European. The Remain vote among Labour members under 35 ran north of 85%. EU membership was not policy preference. It was identity. Internationalism. The architecture of the world they had grown up assuming would continue. The Bennite third, the older trade union tradition, the institutional left with roots in the 1970s sovereignty arguments, Tony Benn's intellectual inheritance, had always opposed the European project. Not for nationalist reasons, for sovereignty and anti-corporate ones, the EU as boss's club, as constraint on socialist economic policy, as vehicle for capital against Labour. Corbyn sat somewhere in that tradition and was deliberately vague. His ambiguity was the glue. While the shared enemy was austerity, nobody had to reconcile the European question. The coalition functioned because the contradiction stayed unspoken. This was the room Starmer inherited in April 2020. He read the volume of the Bennite third as a proxy for its size. The Bennite tradition had spent decades building institutional weight inside Labour. Unions, constituency parties, NEC representation, the apparatus of internal party democracy. By 2020 it had the leadership behind it, the membership majority on key votes, the conference floor. The progressive majority outside the party rooms was real but quieter, more distributed across the country, less likely to attend the meetings where decisions were made. Proximity distorted the sample. The internal map became, for Starmer, the territory. The vocabulary cost compounded everything. By 2020, the language of European alignment had been so thoroughly toxified during the Brexit years that any Labour leader openly defending it was handing reform a ready-made attack line. And handing the Bennite third a grievance to organise around. The political cost of naming the truth was real. Naming it was not survivable internally without a fight Starmer chose not to have. So he made the calculation. The Bennite third and dangerous, the progressive majority was diffuse, and would have nowhere else to go. Solve the internal problem first, build the party first, the country could wait. Party before country. The Conservatives the same mistake on Brexit. Labour was about to make it again, the mechanism identical, the content opposite. The progressive majority did have somewhere else to go. That was the part of the calculation that failed. They left Labour in waves. The party had told them, through 1,000 small signals and a few large ones, that their central political conviction was not something Labour was prepared to defend. The vocabulary cost was Labour's calculation, not theirs. They had not toxified their own beliefs. They had merely had them refused. They went to the Greens. The Greens were broadly anti-establishment, environmentally credible, and crucially perceived as sharing their European position. The activist energy that had been the foundation of Corbyn's Labour was now Polanski's inheritance. But the Greens were not what they appeared either. When Corbyn's Labour collapsed, the radical left needed somewhere to go. It went to the same place. The Greens were hospitable to anti-establishment politics, organisationally less defended than Labour, and offered an institutional vehicle without requiring ideological scrutiny on entry. The radical left arrived in numbers, bringing the full inheritance of the tradition, including the Bennite European scepticism the young progressives had specifically left Labour to escape. This is the cuckoo mechanism. Cuckoos succeed because they exploit hosts with insufficient immune response. The Greens were a near-perfect host. Open internal culture. Hungry for activist energy. No strong institutional memory of how a coherent factional left operates when it arrives in organised numbers. The Young Progressives provided the cover. You cannot reject thousands of new activists without looking like you are suppressing your own growth. The Young Progressives thought they were joining a modern green liberalism. They were joining a coalition in which the Bennite tradition had already begun rebuilding under different paintwork. Polanski inherited the composition. He did not create it. He is now leading a party whose membership disagrees fundamentally about whether European alignment is the central practical question of British politics, or a betrayal of national sovereignty. The conference heckle was the suppressed fracture becoming visible. There will be more. The manifesto process will make them unavoidable. Your party, Corbyn's own attempt to build a vehicle for the displaced left, demonstrated in 18 months what the cuckoo mechanism does without a host institution to absorb its contradictions. The first leadership vote split Corbyn from Sultana before the party had launched. The founding conference saw Sultana boycotting day one. Founding MPs walked. Polling fell from 18% of stated voting intention in July to barely 1% by spring. Negative unity collapsed on contact with the first actual decision required. The lesson is available to anyone reading it. The contradictions do not resolve themselves. They wait, then they arrive all at once. The Liberal Party collapse of the 1920s was a coalition mathematically unsustainable. Once organised alternatives existed for each component. Free trade nonconformists and the emerging working class held together through shared opposition. To landed interest. To conservative hegemony. To clerical Anglicanism. The First World War destroyed the ideological coherence holding it together. Labour took the working class component because organised labour had developed sufficient institutional weight to sustain its own party. The Conservatives took the middle class. The Liberals were left institutionally intact, but coalitionally hollowed out. They kept the organisation after the people had gone. Labour is being hollowed out by the same process from the opposite direction. Still institutionally present, still in government. But the coalition that delivered the 2024 majority was already negative unity, anti-Tory rather than pro-Labour. And negative unity coalitions do not survive the responsibility of governing. The disanalogy is worth holding honestly. Labour is not being replaced by a coherent successor. The fragmentation goes in multiple directions simultaneously. Reform harvests one component, the Greens harvest another, fractured internally as they do it. The Liberal Democrats pick up the metropolitan professional vote in particular constituencies. The depoliticised electorate leaves the system altogether. The Liberals lost cleanly to something coherent. Labour is losing messily to several incoherent things at once. That may be the worst outcome. A companion piece published yesterday named the external environment around British political life. 3 layers. Commercial AI content production driven by global engagement markets, political financial alignment between Reform UK and the American crypto-libertarian network, and strategic alignment with Russian state interests documented across more than a decade of public record. The fire does not need an arsonist. The conditions are ambient. What this piece names is why the British political immune system was not equipped to resist what was coming. The party that should have been organising the structural defence, building electoral reform coalitions, naming the European question honestly, holding the progressive majority intact, preparing the institutional architecture for the prepared environment, was instead consumed by the internal management of the Bennite Third. Every significant decision Labour made between 2020 and 2024 optimised for internal party management at the cost of outward democratic defence. The winter fuel cut, the Mandelson appointment, the asylum positioning that chased reform's framing, the refusal to confront the post-industrial arithmetic honestly. Every choice the same shape, inward, tactical, wrong against the only weather that mattered. Farage spent the same period building a machine, UKIP to Brexit Party to reform. Each vehicle abandoned when it had served its purpose, each abandonment timed deliberately. The core offer and the core audience maintained across every transition. The parliamentary presence, the local government foothold, the membership infrastructure, the candidate pipeline however chaotic, the media relationships. All accumulated deliberately while everyone else was reacting. One party playing the strategic clock, everyone else playing the political clock and calling it strategy. The asymmetry is now mathematical. Reform voters consolidate tactically because the project has trained them to. The Progressive Coalition votes tribally because the institutions that might have organised it never did the work. One side operates in formation. The other side is 6 separate teams pretending the absence of coordination is principle. This is what the prepared environment looks like from the inside. A long accumulation of small decisions made by people protecting institutions rather than countries, until the institutions they protected no longer mattered against the weather they had failed to read. Wes Streeting has resigned from cabinet citing the local election losses. Angela Rayner has been cleared of the tax findings that removed her from office. Josh Simons, the MP for Makerfield in Wigan, a constituency Andy Burnham grew up near and has lived close to for 25 years, resigned his seat on May 14th specifically to create the parliamentary path Burnham needs. Simon's statement was unambiguous. "I'm standing aside so that Andy Burnham can return to his home, fight to re-enter Parliament, and if elected, drive the change our country is crying out for." The by-election is set for June 18th. It is the first time a by-election has been triggered specifically to provide a parliamentary seat for someone not in Parliament since the Leighton by-election of 1965. Farage has promised to throw everything at it. Most current MRP projections put it as a firm reform win. Stop and let that settle. The potential next Labour leader must first win a by-election in a red wall constituency. The polling models say he is likely to lose. The prepared environment is not waiting for the internal arithmetic to resolve. Streeting is the continuity candidate dressed as change. Polished. Communicative. Deeply embedded in the Starmer project until the moment it became electorally untenable. His leadership would represent better management of the same strategic posture that produced this outcome. The prepared environment does not respond to better communication. It requires a different strategic orientation entirely. Rayner has authenticity Starmer never possessed, and a working-class biographical authority that partially answers the question of who Labour speaks for. Her offer is internal reorientation, left of Starmer, where Labour's heart beats, while remaining publicly loyal until the moment requires otherwise. She stops the hemorrhage on one flank without answering the coalition fracture, the depoliticised electorate, or the prepared environment itself. The offer is containment rather than recovery. And the distinction matters. Burnham is the most analytically significant and the most structurally obstructed. He has governed a real place under real constraints. 10 local authorities. Transport infrastructure. Combined authority politics. Delivery against measurable outcomes. That is the boring, unglamorous competence Tim Wilson has been arguing this month is what civilization actually depends on. Burnham has it and can point to it. He has Northern Geographic Authority. He had the only positive net favourability rating in British politics going into this crisis. If Burnham reaches Parliament and the Prime Ministership, the calculation is brutal and the timing is everything. He inherits 2 sinking ships simultaneously. Labour. A coalition mathematically unsustainable, leaking from both flanks, with a depoliticised electorate beyond the reach of any leadership signal. Britain. The post-industrial arithmetic. The strategic clock accelerating. The prepared environment consolidated. The dead spot running into the early 2030s regardless of who holds Downing Street. His strongest moment is the moment he takes office. The novelty premium is short. Months rather than years. The reform machine will harvest the transition chaos. The only viable path that avoids the epitaph of captaining 2 sinking ships simultaneously is a fight-or-die calculation. Call an early general election from that moment of maximum goodwill, with a single strategic objective. Not winning outright, because the arithmetic forecloses that, but producing the hung parliament the progressive strategy requires while the permission structure of a new leadership is still active. Voting intention currently runs at Reform 28%, Conservatives 18%, Labour 18%, Greens 14%, Liberal Democrats 13%. Under first pass, the post that distribution produces a reform-adjacent government, unless the tactical voting discipline the Progressive Coalition has never yet achieved suddenly materialises in defence of a leader who has been in post for weeks. The holes were made below the waterline years before he reached the wheel. The trying is still the right move, but the structural reality is not altered by the quality of the captain. The room nobody read was a room that could have been read. There were people, without significant platforms, who saw the structure of the Corbyn coalition correctly in 2020 and said so. They were ignored. Not because they were wrong, but because the people who needed to hear them were standing too close to the wrong noise. That gap, between mechanism visible and outcome visible, was the window in which intervention was possible. It is now closed. What we are watching is the consequence of one coalition being misread by one person at one moment. compounded by 1,000 subsequent decisions that protected the institution rather than the country. The Conservatives made the mistake first and were punished for it. Labour has made it second and is being punished in turn. The pattern repeats because the temptation repeats. Defending the party feels responsible. Defending the country requires accepting that the party may not survive what defending the country requires. The piece describes the most plausible structural trajectory. It cannot model what no one sees coming. Honest analysis includes knowing what it cannot do. A room without a captain is not the same as a room without people in it. The work of staying, of refusing to leave, of holding what is left of the institutional architecture together until conditions change, is harder than it has been at any point in this project's analysis. It is also the only work that remains available. The room does not care whether anyone is reading it now. Read it anyway. Stay in the room.